Long before Camilla became Charles's wife, long before she stood beside him as queen, she made him a private promise. "I'd suffer anything for you. That's love. It's the strength of love." Camilla said those words to Charles in December 1989. During a telephone conversation, neither of them believed the rest of the world would ever hear. At the time, they were just words spoken between two people clinging to a relationship that had already become dangerous. But the years that followed would turn those words into something closer to a prophecy, because loving Charles didn't simply mean waiting for him. It meant watching her private life become public property. Her marriage ended. Charles's marriage collapsed under extraordinary scrutiny. Camilla's name became permanently welded to Diana's pain. Newspapers mocked her appearance. Photographers followed her everywhere. People who'd never met her decided exactly who she was. And even when both Charles and Camilla were finally divorced, they still couldn't simply marry. There were Diana's sons to consider. There was the Queen. There was the church. There was the public itself. Then Diana died in 1997, and whatever future Charles and Camilla had imagined became almost impossible to speak about openly. More than 3 decades after that private call, Camilla was approaching her 75th birthday when she was asked about living through years of relentless public criticism. Her answer was remarkably simple. "It's not easy." She explained that after being scrutinized for so long, she'd eventually had to find a way to live with it and carry on. Those two statements were made more than 30 years apart. One was never intended for the public. The other was spoken knowing the entire world could hear it, and between them lies the real story. Because Camilla didn't simply wait 30 years for Charles. She lived through those years. And once we look carefully at what actually happened, the familiar love story starts to crack. Because there's one serious problem with the version most people remember. Camilla wasn't actually waiting for Charles in the way we've been led to believe. If you value royal stories built on real evidence rather than recycled gossip, give this video a like and subscribe. There's far more to this story than the headlines ever showed. Now, before we go any further, here's the only promise worth making. We're not going to turn this into a defense of Camilla. We're not going to attack Diana. And we're not going to tell another romantic fairy tale about two people destined to end up together. We're going to follow what can actually be proved, using royal household records, Hansard, the Privy Council record, Charles's own recorded words, Camilla's own interviews, Diana's authenticated testimony, and witnesses who were actually there. And when a source has a problem, we won't hide it. That matters especially with Diana's 1995 Panorama interview. Lord Dyson later found that Martin Bashir used fabricated bank material in his dealings with Earl Spencer to reach Diana, conduct Dyson described as a serious breach of the BBC's rules on straight dealing. Diana's words don't simply disappear because of Bashir, but we need to know how that interview came about before treating it as uncomplicated evidence. So let's start with the biggest myth in this entire story. Camilla didn't spend 30 years sitting somewhere waiting for Charles. She married Andrew Parker Bowles. They had 2 children, Tom and Laura, and built a family life of their own. The royal household's official biography records that marriage and those children plainly. The real story is harder than the romantic version. Charles and Camilla formed an attachment when they were young. They married other people. They built families. Boundaries were crossed. People were hurt. And years passed before marriage between them was even possible. Which leaves the first question most people never bother asking. If Charles cared for Camilla so deeply at the beginning, why didn't he simply marry her the first time? The phrase, "Camilla waited 30 years for Charles," feels true because it compresses everything into one clean line. Young love, separation, other marriages, scandal, reunion, wedding, but real lives don't happen that neatly. By the time Charles and Camilla married in April 2005, more than 3 decades had passed since their early relationship. Those years weren't one uninterrupted romance. They certainly weren't 30 years spent planning a future marriage. And once you pull that thread, 3 very different questions emerge. Questions that royal history usually tangles into one. Did Charles and Camilla remain emotionally important to each other? The evidence says yes. Their connection survived extraordinary upheaval in both their lives. Did they remain continuously involved in a physical relationship? Much harder. Accounts differ sharply about exactly when friendship became an affair, stopped being one, and became one again. And did Camilla spend those years expecting Charles would eventually marry her? Harder still. There's no reliable documentary record showing Camilla spending the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s quietly working toward the crown. In fact, her life went in another direction entirely. British Vogue's profile of Camilla puts it simply: she and the Prince of Wales had been romantically involved before they both married other people. And those other marriages weren't footnotes. They became entire adult lives. Charles moved deeper into the strange position he'd occupied since childhood: son of the Queen, heir to the throne, serving officer, future head of the Church of England, and a man whose eventual choice of wife was never going to be treated as private. Camilla became part of a different family. She had a husband, children came, there were school runs, friends, dogs, gardens, weekends in the country, all the ordinary details that disappear when history reduces somebody to one role. Even the royal household records it plainly. Camilla's marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles produced Tom in 1974 and Laura in 1978, and that marriage didn't formally end until 1995. So when we look backward from 2005, there's a powerful temptation to turn everything that came before into preparation, to treat every earlier decision as inevitable. It wasn't. A relationship can remain emotionally powerful without being continuously physical. Two people can remain important to each other without having agreed that they'll eventually marry. And a woman who later became queen can have lived decades of her life without secretly treating the crown as her destination. Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, would make exactly that point years later when claims surfaced that his mother had pursued some long-term endgame. His answer was striking. He said there hadn't been an endgame. In his view, his mother had simply married the person she loved. A son can't tell us everything his mother privately thought 30 or 40 years earlier, but neither can a headline. And an enduring attachment isn't proof of an uninterrupted affair. An affair isn't proof of a lifelong plan to marry. And the marriage that finally happened in 2005 doesn't turn every choice before it into part of some royal master plan. Now, to understand why Charles and Camilla ended up marrying other people, we have to go back to a young Prince of Wales who hadn't yet decided what kind of husband he was prepared to become. In the early 1970s, Charles and Camilla weren't the figures later generations would argue about. They were young, and their world was small. Not small in wealth or privilege, small in the sense that the same names kept turning up at the same houses, the same sporting events, the same parties and the same tables. Polo mattered. So did horses. So did family connections. Charles had played polo at Cambridge and continued playing as a young naval officer. The royal household still records polo as an important part of his sporting life, including matches connected with the Royal Navy. Camilla Shand fitted naturally into that world. She'd grown up in Sussex, loved horses, and, by the mid-1960s, had entered the social circuit that brought together young men and women from families connected to the military, landed society, and the royal household. And there was something about Camilla that appears again and again in descriptions from people who knew that circle. She wasn't awed by Charles. Almost everyone Charles met already knew who he was before he entered the room. He wasn't simply Charles, he was the Prince of Wales. People adjusted around him. Camilla didn't seem particularly interested in doing that. She was older than him by a little over a year, socially confident, comfortable around horses and polo, and already experienced in the ordinary business of dating and relationships in a way that Charles simply wasn't. There are famous stories about the precise moment they first met. Some place it at polo, others place their introduction through a mutual friend. Neat lines of dialogue have been attached to that first meeting too, including jokes about Camilla's great-grandmother Alice Keppel being Edward VII's mistress. Wonderful television, exactly the sort of details that become unreliable when a story has been retold too many times. What the stronger sources support is enough. By the early 1970s, Charles and Camilla were moving through the same social world, they became close, and they dated before either of them married. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized account and contemporary retrospective reporting both support that basic fact. And Charles appears to have taken the relationship seriously. Dimbleby's biography says, Charles considered the possibility of marrying Camilla. But here's the detail that later versions of the story almost always skip. Charles himself wasn't ready. Dimbleby's account says he felt too young to take such a major step. That changes everything about the emotional balance of this story. It's much easier to say Charles wanted Camilla, the palace said no, and tragedy followed. It's much harder to accept that Charles may have had the opportunity to make a decision and simply didn't make it. He was in his early 20s, his life was already accelerating. He'd completed Cambridge, he'd been invested as Prince of Wales, he'd taken his seat in the House of Lords, he was training with the RAF. Then came the Navy. And hanging above all of it was a responsibility few young men could fully understand. At some point, the woman he married wouldn't simply become his wife. She was expected to become the future queen. There was no Diana yet, no Morton tapes, no leaked telephone conversation. No argument over whether Camilla could ever be queen. Nobody standing beside them at Polo could see 1992, 1997, 2005, or 2022 coming. Charles cared deeply for Camilla. Camilla also had a complicated history with another man, and Charles still hadn't asked her to become his wife. Then his naval life took him away. And one of the most repeated explanations for everything that followed begins right there. The story has been told so many times, it's become royal folklore. Charles loved Camilla. The establishment didn't approve, so Charles was sent to sea. While he was away, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. By the time Charles returned, the woman he really loved was gone. It's tidy, maybe too tidy, because once you put the official dates beside the romantic version, something interesting happens. Charles's military path hadn't suddenly appeared as a response to Camilla. He'd begun RAF training at Cranwell on 8 March 1971. His Royal Navy career started in September 1971. He qualified as a helicopter pilot in 1974 and remained in naval service until 1976. Now compare that with the relationship timeline. The New Yorker's detailed 1997 account places Charles and Camilla becoming close around the summer of 1971. In other words, Charles's military career was already underway before that account even places their romance at its starting point. Now, that's not proof that nobody around Charles disliked the idea of Camilla as a royal bride. Attitudes inside his family and among older advisors were absolutely shaped by the expectations of the period. And those expectations sound astonishingly old-fashioned now. Charles's great-uncle and mentor, Lord Mountbatten, gave him advice about marriage that drew a sharp line between women a young man might date and the sort of inexperienced, suitable woman he ought eventually to marry. Surviving correspondence reported by serious biographers shows Mountbatten was actively telling Charles what kind of bride he should choose. That's evidence of an attitude. It's not evidence of a plot. To say the royal world of the early 1970s had restrictive ideas about the future king's wife is reasonable. To say Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, or Mountbatten definitively arranged Charles's naval deployment to remove Camilla requires much stronger proof, and the public record doesn't give us that. Put the pieces together, and the tragedy looks less like two lovers ripped apart by a single palace order. It looks like hesitation meeting timing. Charles left to fulfill duties he'd already begun training for. Camilla wasn't under any obligation to freeze her own life until he decided what he wanted. And there's a part people consistently forget. Andrew Parker Bowles hadn't suddenly appeared because Charles went away. He was already there. Camilla had known and dated Andrew before her relationship with Charles. Long before Britain knew Camilla as the woman attached to the Prince of Wales, she'd had an on and off relationship with Andrew, a cavalry officer who moved through the same world of horses, military life, and royal connections. The New Yorker's account describes Camilla dating Andrew before Charles entered the picture and notes that Andrew was serving in Germany during the period when Charles and Camilla became close. So when Charles went away on naval duties and Camilla's relationship with Andrew moved toward marriage, she wasn't choosing between a prince she'd loved all her life and a stranger who had suddenly appeared. She was making a decision inside a tangled set of relationships that already existed, and she chose Andrew. They married on 4 July 1973, at the Guards Chapel in Wellington Barracks. This wasn't some quiet ceremony designed to hide disappointment. It was a major society wedding, attended by figures from the royal circle. Contemporary accounts record royal guests including the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and Princess Anne. The worlds weren't separate. Andrew Parker Bowles wasn't standing outside royal society. He belonged comfortably within it. And the wedding didn't exile Camilla from Charles's circle either. The networks around them overlapped, friends overlapped, sporting life overlapped, families knew one another. That's one reason everything that came later became so impossibly complicated. Camilla then became a mother. Tom was born in 1974. Laura followed in 1978. And for years there was an entire Camilla Parker Bowles that the later scandal almost erased. Not the Queen, not the future Duchess of Cornwall, not the woman whose name would eventually appear beside Diana's in newspaper headlines around the world. A mother, living a country life. One contemporary profile described her collecting her children from the station, tending her roses, and doing the ordinary things expected of a well-connected country wife. Accounts from that social circle describe an unconventional marriage, and Andrew as a man with relationships of his own. But the detail comes from friends, acquaintances, and later biographies rather than documents created inside the marriage. We don't know exactly what Andrew tolerated, what hurt him, what arrangements existed privately, or how husband and wife explained their marriage to each other at every stage. What we do know is that it lasted more than 20 years. That's too long to treat as a waiting room. And once somebody eventually becomes queen, people begin looking backward for proof that she always wanted to be queen. Her clothes become evidence. Her friendships become evidence. Every choice becomes strategy, but there's an uncomfortable truth on the other side too. Giving Camilla her own adult life doesn't mean pretending Charles ceased to matter. He didn't. Their circles continued to overlap. Their friendship survived. Charles even became godfather to Tom. There were encounters, conversations, and a familiarity that didn't simply vanish when Camilla became Mrs. Parker Bowles. But every contact wasn't necessarily an affair, and from this point in the story, the evidence starts becoming much harder to handle. Because the next period contains some of the sharpest disagreements in the entire Charles and Camilla story. There are dates people repeat as though somebody wrote them into a diary at the time. They didn't. After Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, Charles remained connected to her world. They shared friends. They appeared in the same social settings. Charles knew her family, Camilla understood him unusually well, and people who watched them together later described an emotional connection that hadn't gone away. But when did that connection become sexual again? One later account gives you the late 1970s. Another points to 1986. Another tells the story as if Charles and Camilla barely paused at all. If we pick whichever date makes the best drama, we're no longer doing history. So there are three distinct strands we need to follow. The first is what can safely be established. Charles and Camilla remained important figures in each other's lives. By the later 1970s, people within their circle were noticing the intensity between them. The New Yorker's 1997 investigation quoted contemporaries who remembered how Charles looked at Camilla and reported a belief within that social world that their relationship had resumed before Charles ever met Diana. The second strand is Charles's own account. When Jonathan Dimbleby interviewed him publicly in 1994, Charles was asked directly about fidelity during his marriage to Diana. His answer would become one of the most consequential sentences he'd ever spoken on television. Charles said he'd been faithful until the marriage had become irretrievably broken down, with both of them having tried. Dimbleby's authorized biography placed the renewed intimate relationship with Camilla around 1986, when Charles believed the marriage to Diana had already failed. That's Charles's version. It deserves to be recorded accurately. It doesn't automatically become the only version simply because Charles said it. And that brings us to the third strand, what remains genuinely disputed. The New Yorker's 1997 account, drawing on people from their social circle, placed a renewed Charles-Camilla relationship considerably earlier, in the late 1970s, when Camilla was already married and already a mother. Other biographers produce still more variations. Some describe periods of intimacy followed by pauses. Some draw sharper lines around Charles's marriage to Diana. Some rely on unnamed royal staff remembering events many years later. And once those accounts are repeated in documentaries, newspapers, and television dramas, the uncertainty tends to disappear. A date becomes the date. A recollection becomes what happened. A theory becomes a scene. There's another reason to resist that temptation. Knowing that Charles and Camilla later conducted an affair makes it very easy to read every earlier interaction backward through that knowledge. A photograph together becomes evidence of sex. A telephone call becomes proof of betrayal. A friendship becomes a conspiracy. People can cross an emotional boundary long before a physical one. They can move backward as well as forward. They can stop, start again, tell themselves one version of what they're doing, while the people around them see something completely different. So at this stage, here's where the evidence genuinely leaves us. Charles and Camilla had been romantically involved before her marriage. They remained connected afterward. There are credible recollections suggesting renewed intimacy before Charles married Diana. Charles's authorized version places his adultery later, after he believed the marriage to Diana had broken down. Those accounts don't fit perfectly together, and we don't need to force them to, because very soon there will be admissions, recorded words, direct testimony, people speaking in their own voices. But we're not there yet. For now, one thing matters more than choosing an exact secret date. By the end of the 1970s, Charles still hadn't settled the question everyone around the heir to the throne knew would eventually have to be answered. Who would he marry? Camilla already had a husband and 2 children. Charles was moving through his 30s with the expectations around his future becoming harder to ignore. Then another family entered the picture, the Spencers. And in 1980, Charles began seriously seeing a young woman he'd first met several years earlier. She was 19 years old. Her name was Lady Diana Spencer, and what had once been an ambiguous private relationship between Charles and Camilla was about to acquire consequences none of them could keep private forever. By 1980, the question around Charles had shifted dramatically. It was no longer simply whether he wanted to marry. People around the Prince of Wales were increasingly concerned with whom he was going to marry, and time was no longer helping him. Charles was 31. He was the heir to the throne. The woman he eventually chose wouldn't simply share his private life. She'd inherit a public role carrying expectations built over generations. Patrick Jepson, who later became Diana's private secretary, described Charles as being under enormous pressure from both his parents and the press to find a wife. Then Lady Diana Spencer came into view. And before anything else, it's worth remembering just how young she was. Diana had been born on 1 July 1961. When her engagement to Charles was announced on 24 February 1981, she was 19 years old. She'd left school only a few years earlier, spent time at finishing school in Switzerland, moved into a London flat with friends, looked after children, and worked at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico. She wasn't arriving after years of adult experience inside royal life. She was stepping straight into its center, and she was doing it beside a man, more than 12 years older, who'd already spent years carrying out royal duties, serving in the military, and moving through a social world Diana was only beginning to understand. Their families weren't strangers. The Spencers had long connections to the royal family. Diana's grandmother, Lady Fermoy, had been close to the Queen Mother. Charles and Diana had met when she was younger, then encountered each other again as adults. But the courtship that led to marriage moved quickly. Years later, on the recordings Diana made for Andrew Morton through their intermediary James Colthurst, she remembered Charles asking her to marry him. Her reaction was almost startlingly youthful. She said she laughed because at first she thought he was joking. Then, according to Diana's taped recollection, Charles told her that one day she'd be queen. Whatever doubts appeared later, Diana's feelings at the time shouldn't be rewritten through hindsight. Morton, who secretly worked with Diana on the 1992 book, later said plainly that she had been deeply in love with Charles. Reuters independently confirms that Diana secretly cooperated with Morton, and Morton later explained that Diana had recorded answers to his questions and reviewed the material before publication. She hoped, she believed in it, and millions of people believed with her. On 29 July 1981, Charles and Diana married at St. Paul's Cathedral. The royal household estimates the television and radio audience at around 1 billion people, with hundreds of thousands more lining the route through London. Diana wore the Emmanuel wedding dress with its 25-foot train. The ceremony had all the scale the marriage itself would soon struggle to carry. For women watching at home that morning, particularly in Britain, America, Canada, and Australia, Diana didn't feel like a constitutional solution to the heir's marriage problem. She looked like the beginning of something. That emotional investment is part of this story, because when the marriage later broke apart, people weren't simply watching 2 wealthy adults divorce. They felt that something they'd been personally invited to believe in had failed. But there was already one person in Charles's wider world whom Diana couldn't easily put aside. Camilla. Not because we need to assume an affair was continuing through the wedding. The evidence doesn't let us make that leap safely. But Camilla's presence mattered to Diana because Diana herself said it mattered. And here we can hear Diana, rather than guessing for her. On the Morton recordings, Diana remembered opening diaries with Charles and seeing photographs of Camilla fall out. Then came something that stayed with her through the honeymoon. At a formal dinner during that trip, Diana noticed Charles wearing cufflinks formed from 2 intertwined letter C's. She believed they had come from Camilla, asked Charles directly, and said he confirmed they were a gift from a friend. Diana's description of her own reaction was blunt. Jealousy, total jealousy. That proves Diana remembered feeling threatened by Camilla. It proves those details were significant enough for her to record them years later for Morton. It doesn't, by itself, prove Charles and Camilla were conducting a continuous physical affair during the honeymoon. Calling Diana's fears irrational would be unfair. Turning every fear into independent proof of an affair would be unfair too. Diana's experience belongs to Diana, and those anxieties existed while she was trying to learn one of the most exposed roles in Britain. The speed of the change in her life was remarkable. Within months, the former kindergarten assistant was being bowed to, photographed from every angle, scrutinized for what she wore, and expected to perform as the Princess of Wales before audiences around the world. Then came motherhood. Prince William was born on 21 June 1982. Prince Harry followed on the 15th September 1984. Those boys changed everything. Whatever was happening between husband and wife now existed inside a family, and whatever Charles felt about Camilla could no longer be discussed as though three unattached adults were involved. There were spouses, there were children, there was an heir to the throne, and there was a young Princess of Wales who already believed another woman occupied a place in her husband's emotional life that she couldn't reach. But for the first years of the marriage, the question isn't whether Diana feared Camilla. She clearly did. The harder question is whether the affair had actually resumed, and this is where 5 years of royal history get constantly crushed into one sentence. Charles married Diana in 1981. Charles later admitted adultery. Therefore, the simplified version goes, Charles must have been carrying on with Camilla throughout the marriage. It sounds straightforward, the evidence isn't. The years immediately after the wedding contain some of the sharpest contradictions in this entire story. One version comes from people close to Diana, who believed Charles's attachment to Camilla had never truly gone away. Another came from people around Charles and Camilla who insisted there had been a genuine break. The New Yorker, after speaking with people from both sides, recorded that split rather than pretending it could be resolved. Friends of Diana believed Charles was in contact with Camilla early in the marriage. Patty Palmer Tompkinson, who was close to Camilla, gave a very different account, insisting there'd been no serious contact between the two for 5 years. Dimbleby's authorized account also rejected the idea that Charles entered marriage expecting to maintain both a wife and a mistress. Those accounts can't all be stretched into the same story. Diana's suspicions were real, they affected her deeply, but the existence of suspicion doesn't give us access to every private conversation Charles and Camilla had. Then there's Charles's later admission. In 1994, Dimbleby asked him directly whether he'd tried to be faithful and honorable during his marriage. Charles answered yes. When pressed, he said he'd remained faithful until the marriage had become irretrievably broken down, after both he and Diana had tried to make it work. He was publicly drawing a line. Before that line, he'd been faithful. After it, he hadn't. His authorized biography placed the renewed relationship with Camilla around 1986. We don't have to accept that date simply because it came from Charles, but we can't move it backwards simply because another date makes the story more dramatic. A marriage can be in emotional trouble long before either spouse begins another physical relationship. Charles and Diana's difficulties weren't caused by a single switch being flipped on one particular night. They had differences in age, temperament, expectations, and interests. They were also learning to be parents while performing royal life in public. The royal household's own chronology shows how much their public and family lives overlapped. Overseas tours, engagements across Britain, William's birth, Harry's birth. From the pavement, photographs could still show a royal family. Inside the marriage, Diana described something far less secure. Her Morton tapes show that Camilla occupied Diana's thoughts from very early on. The photographs, the cufflinks, the arguments, her own jealousy. Those tapes are genuine evidence of Diana's state of mind. They aren't independent proof of every conclusion she drew from what she saw. By the middle of the decade, though, the picture begins to change. Even Charles's own version accepts that there came a point when he resumed an intimate relationship outside his marriage. His authorized chronology places that point around 1986. Diana was becoming extraordinarily successful in public, developing an instinctive connection with crowds that couldn't be taught. Charles had his own interests, his own causes, his own way of approaching royal duty. Publicly, they could still function as the Prince and Princess of Wales. Privately, the space between them was growing wider. Whatever exact date one chooses for the physical relationship resuming, by the later 1980s the consequences were no longer theoretical. Diana believed she knew what was happening. Charles was increasingly dependent on Camilla. And the private arrangement that had survived through shared friends and discreet meetings was moving towards something much harder to contain. Then came 1989. And suddenly we're no longer dealing only with people remembering the past years later. Two events from that year leave us with something far more immediate than reconstructed memory. One came from Diana, the other came directly from Charles and Camilla. The first happened at a party. Diana later described it on the recordings made for Morton. She'd reached a point where avoiding Camilla was no longer enough. According to Diana's own account, Charles and Camilla moved away from the main gathering during the evening. Diana went looking for them. Diana remembered confronting Camilla directly, telling her, in substance, that she knew what was happening between Camilla and Charles. She remembered Camilla responding by pointing to everything Diana appeared to possess: admiration, attention, two beautiful children. Diana's answer, as she later recalled it, came down to one thing: she wanted her husband. For years, Camilla had existed in Diana's marriage as photographs, gifts, suspicions, telephone calls, and a name that carried enormous emotional weight. Now Diana was addressing the woman herself. She wasn't a 19-year-old bride anymore. She was 28. She was the mother of William and Harry, and she'd decided she wasn't going to pretend she saw nothing. The cleanest evidence for Diana's words remains her own later recollection. That's enough. We don't need to decorate it. Because another piece of evidence from 1989 requires no later memory from Diana at all. In December, Charles and Camilla had a private telephone conversation. They weren't speaking for newspapers. They weren't speaking to biographers. They weren't explaining themselves to the public. They thought they were speaking only to each other. The conversation was recorded and the transcript was eventually published in January 1993. Contemporary reporting described it as roughly 6 minutes of sleepy affection, jokes, longing, and practical discussion about how and when they could communicate without attracting attention. The sexual passage became famous. We don't need it. In fact, concentrating on it hides the more revealing part of the conversation. Listen to the tone beneath the embarrassment that later surrounded the tape. Charles and Camilla weren't talking like two people testing a new attraction. There was ease between them, familiarity, private humor, concern, the language of two people who knew exactly how the other one thought. Charles spoke about what Camilla had endured because of their connection. Camilla's response was the line we heard at the very beginning of this story. We don't need to repeat it. Now we know exactly where it belongs. The published transcript captures Charles praising Camilla, Camilla brushing the praise away, the two of them teasing one another, and Charles acknowledging the difficulties she faced because of their relationship. There was emotional dependence here. Charles spoke openly about needing reassurance. Camilla supplied it naturally. She listened to his worries. She offered affection. She wanted to read a speech he'd been working on. These aren't the details people remember from the scandal. But they're the details that explain why the relationship endured across decades. The tape also contains practical caution about Camilla's husband, which tells us something else plainly. Whatever private understanding existed, secrecy still mattered. And that's where the two events of 1989 converge. Diana's confrontation tells us what Diana believed and how fiercely she felt it. The telephone recording tells us directly how Charles and Camilla spoke to each other when they thought nobody else could hear. One is remembered testimony, the other is a recorded conversation. Together, they tell us more than any anonymous palace source ever could. By the end of 1989, this was no longer a shadow from Charles's past. Diana had confronted it. Charles and Camilla were speaking with unmistakable intimacy. Two marriages were still intact on paper. And almost nobody outside their circle had heard the evidence for themselves. Not yet. For 3 more years, those private words remained outside ordinary public knowledge. Then Britain's royal crisis broke wide open, and Camilla stopped being a woman most people barely knew. By the beginning of 1992, the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage was no longer something only their friends and staff could see. There had been years of rumors. Separate lives were becoming harder to disguise. But the public still didn't know what Diana herself believed had happened inside that marriage. Then, Andrew Morton published a book, and everything changed. Diana, her true story appeared in June 1992. To readers at the time, it looked like a biography assembled from people close to the princess. What almost nobody knew was that Diana herself was the source at the heart of it. She had secretly answered Morton's questions on tape through her friend Dr. James Coldhurst, who acted as the go-between. Diana and Morton didn't sit together conducting formal interviews. Her recorded answers were carried out of Kensington Palace and passed to him without the palace knowing what was happening. Reuters later confirmed her secret cooperation. For the first time, the public was effectively hearing Diana's version of the marriage, without being told that Diana was the person speaking, and what she described was nothing like the marriage Britain thought it had watched. The book revealed her account of bulimia, profound unhappiness, suicidal behavior, emotional isolation, and her belief that Charles's relationship with Camilla had poisoned everything. Reuters records that the book portrayed Diana as trapped in a loveless marriage. But Diana's testimony did something else that proved devastating for Camilla. It gave the public a point of view. Until then, Camilla had largely existed in newspaper whispers. Now she had a role in a story millions of people were reading from the perspective of the young woman they'd watched marry Charles in 1981. Diana wasn't describing royal marriage as some distant constitutional problem. She was describing what it had felt like to live inside it, the loneliness, the pressure, the feeling that people around the institution didn't understand what was happening to her, and the belief that there was another woman emotionally present in a marriage that was supposed to belong to two people. Diana's suffering wasn't invented by a newspaper columnist. Those recordings existed. Diana made them. And once Morton's book appeared, the public began interpreting Charles and Camilla through Diana's pain. That changed the balance almost overnight. Diana still couldn't publicly admit she'd helped Morton. The value of the book depended partly on that secrecy, so Britain was absorbing her testimony while the palace was dealing with a publication whose true source remained hidden. It created one of the strangest information battles in modern royal history. The people inside the story knew more than the people watching it. The public knew more than the palace wanted publicly discussed. And almost every new revelation encouraged another newspaper to search for the next one. Then, in August, Diana lost some privacy of her own. Newspapers published extracts from a recorded telephone conversation between Diana and James Gilby, the businessman who repeatedly used an affectionate nickname for her during the call. Intimate telephone conversations were becoming material for national consumption on both sides of the failing marriage. This wasn't simply a royal marriage breaking down anymore. It was becoming a contest over who would define why it had broken down. And Diana had one enormous advantage. People heard pain in her story. They remembered the 19-year-old from 1981. They remembered the wedding. They remembered William and Harry arriving. Diana's unhappiness felt like a betrayal of something they themselves had been encouraged to believe. Camilla now stood on the other side of that emotion. Then December came. On 9 December 1992, Prime Minister John Major stood in the House of Commons and read a statement from Buckingham Palace. The Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. At that point, Buckingham Palace said they had no plans to divorce. Their constitutional positions were unchanged. They would both continue raising William and Harry and carrying out separate programs of public engagements. Then came a request that sounds almost painful knowing what happened next. The Queen and Prince Philip hoped that intrusion into Charles and Diana's privacy might now cease. Parliament echoed the appeal. They wanted space, quiet, protection for the children. Instead, the separation created a vacuum. And the press rushed straight into it. Because if Charles and Diana were now officially apart, every unanswered question about why the marriage had failed suddenly became more valuable than ever. Camilla was no longer merely a rumored figure from Charles's private life. She was becoming part of the national explanation for the failure of the most famous marriage in Britain. And barely a month later, the public heard something far more intimate than anything Morton had printed. In January 1993, the private conversation Charles and Camilla had believed belonged only to them finally became mass entertainment. We've already heard what that 1989 recording established about the relationship. What matters now is what happened when Britain heard it. The transcript was published 4 years after the conversation took place, and only weeks after the Wales separation had been announced. The timing couldn't have been worse. A private relationship that had lived for years behind closed doors was suddenly available for strangers to read line by line. The sexual passage became the headline. Newspapers made sure of that. But for Camilla, the damage went far beyond embarrassment over one private exchange. Her voice was now public property. Her humor was public property. Her marriage was public property. Her feelings toward Charles were public property. Even the way she spoke to him when she believed nobody was listening became something millions of strangers felt entitled to judge. And there was no way for her to answer without making things worse. If she gave an interview, she risked looking as though she were fighting Diana publicly. If she defended herself, she'd have to discuss an adulterous relationship while still married to Andrew Parker Bowles. If she stayed silent, other people got to define her. so Camilla stayed largely silent. The newspapers didn't. The reaction moved quickly from criticism of behavior into criticism of the woman herself, her face, her hair, her clothes, her age, her body, her supposed lack of glamour beside Diana. The New Yorker's 1997 account noted that newspapers ran photographs of Diana and Camilla side by side and awarded marks for things like appearance, fashion, and posture. Think about what that meant. The argument was no longer only, was the relationship wrong? It became, how could Charles prefer her? And underneath that question sat a particularly cruel assumption, that adultery might have somehow made more sense if Camilla had looked more like Diana. That was the level to which the story had fallen. None of this means the public had no reason to feel angry. Diana had been hurt. Charles and Camilla had crossed boundaries affecting 2 marriages. There were children inside those families. People who'd watched the 1981 wedding had every right to feel the story they'd been sold wasn't the reality. The issue was scale. Camilla wasn't a working royal. She had no public office. She didn't have a taxpayer-funded communications machine built around her. Yet by 1993 she was being discussed internationally as though every part of her private life belonged to the audience. The published call also removed something Charles and Camilla had spent years maintaining: plausible distance. Royal correspondents no longer had to rely on rumors about how close the pair were. Millions could read the intimacy for themselves. The New Yorker later described the publication as the first real chance for people outside their private circle to hear Camilla in her own voice. The same account recorded calls for Charles to end the relationship and a severe drop in his popularity. But Charles still had something Camilla didn't: a formal public identity independent of the scandal. He remained Prince of Wales. He had charities, tours, speeches, military connections, a constitutional future. Camilla had none of that insulation. To millions of people, she was becoming known almost entirely through one relationship, and that would shape everything that followed, because the most consequential public admission wasn't going to come from Camilla at all. It would come from Charles. On 29 June 1994, millions of viewers watched Charles, the private man, the public role, Jonathan Dimbleby's television portrait of the Prince of Wales. The project was supposed to let Britons see more of the man behind the title. Instead, one answer swallowed everything else. Charles acknowledged adultery on television, not through an unnamed friend, not through a newspaper leak, not through Diana's account, from Charles himself. Reuters records that around 15 million people watched the interview, and that Charles's admission immediately became the defining story. Then, the following day, his private secretary, Richard Aylard, removed the last trace of ambiguity at a press briefing. The woman connected to Charles's admission was Camilla Parker Bowles. The telephone transcript had exposed intimacy. Now Charles's own office connected her directly to his admission that he'd been unfaithful. For Charles, the interview was an attempt at honesty. For Camilla, it meant the heir to the throne had effectively placed their private relationship into the official record of his failed marriage. And she still wasn't speaking. That silence is worth noticing. Because 1994 is usually remembered as another year in the royal scandal, for Camilla, it also contained something far more private. Her mother was dying. Rosalind Shand had osteoporosis. The disease had already touched the family. Camilla's maternal grandmother had died from the same condition. In 1994, Rosalind died at the age of 72. The royal household's biography records both deaths and states that Camilla began supporting osteoporosis work that same year, long before it became one of the causes most closely associated with her later public life. There's no need to force those two parts of 1994 into dramatic connection. The facts are strong enough simply sitting beside each other. Publicly, Camilla had just been formally identified as the woman in the Prince of Wales's adulterous relationship. Privately, she lost her mother. One story filled newspapers, the other happened inside her family, and there was still another consequence moving toward her. Camilla was married. Andrew Parker Bowles had now watched years of speculation about his wife move from gossip to taped evidence to an admission by the future king. Whatever arrangements or understandings had existed privately between Andrew and Camilla, public humiliation is something very different from private accommodation. Within months, another marriage would formally end, this time Camilla's own. In January 1995, Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles announced their intention to divorce. Their lawyers issued a joint statement. One fact in that statement told its own story. They said they'd already been living apart for 2 years. So this wasn't a happy marriage suddenly destroyed overnight by Charles's television interview. The separation inside the Parker Bowles household had already happened. But the public ending came after more than 20 years of marriage, and after Camilla's relationship with Charles had become impossible to keep out of the national conversation. We won't invent Andrew's thoughts. He didn't leave us a reliable diary explaining each stage. There are later accounts claiming he tolerated more than an ordinary husband might. There are stories about the social world they belonged to and the way relationships operated within it. But knowing those stories exist isn't the same as knowing what Andrew felt when his marriage finally ended. He and Camilla had married in 1973. They'd had Tom and Laura. They'd built more than 2 decades of family history. They'd been living separately before the divorce announcement. And in 1995, the marriage was formally dissolved. That ending is important because Camilla's first family didn't disappear when the marriage did. Tom was 20, Laura was 16. They weren't characters in Charles and Diana's story. They were Camilla and Andrew's children. They had their own father, their own family history, their own experience of watching their mother's name become something strangers shouted, printed, and joked about. The scandal didn't land on 3 adults alone. It landed on families. And when people speak of 1995 as though Camilla had finally cleared some obstacle between herself and Charles, legally she was now divorced. Emotionally and politically, almost nothing had been cleared. Charles was still married. Diana remained Princess of Wales. William and Harry remained at the center of both their parents' lives. And Camilla's public reputation was, if anything, worse than before. There was no engagement waiting, no palace statement saying Charles would now marry her, no obvious path to royal acceptance. Camilla had lost a marriage without gaining a public future. Then Diana made a decision that changed the balance again. In November 1995, almost a year and a half after Charles had spoken to Dimbleby, Britain sat down to hear the Princess of Wales answer questions on television. This time, Diana wouldn't be speaking secretly through tapes carried out of Kensington Palace. The camera would be directly in front of her, and she was about to say one sentence that would attach Camilla to the royal marriage more powerfully than any newspaper headline ever had. On 20 November 1995, BBC Panorama broadcast Martin Bashir's interview with Diana. It became one of the defining royal television moments of the 20th century. Diana discussed her marriage, her own infidelity, Charles, her future, the pressures around her, and Camilla. Asked about Charles's relationship with Camilla and its effect on the marriage, Diana delivered the sentence that survived everything else. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. For Camilla, that sentence was devastating because of who said it. This wasn't Morton paraphrasing Diana. This wasn't an unnamed friend. This wasn't a leaked tape. It was Diana, looking into a television camera and publicly placing Camilla inside the failure of her marriage. Millions of people who already sympathized with Diana now had a phrase they could remember forever. Camilla had almost no comparable public voice. Charles had spoken. Diana had spoken. Camilla remained mostly silent. But there's something we know now that viewers in 1995 didn't know. And if we're going to use Diana's words as evidence, we have to tell the full story of how that interview came about. In 2021, Lord Dyson completed an independent investigation into Bashir's methods. His report found something complicated. By August 1995, Diana was already keen on the idea of a television interview and probably would have agreed to speak with an experienced reporter she trusted, even without Bashir's intervention. Diana wanted to speak. We shouldn't erase her agency simply because Bashir behaved improperly. But Dyson also established what Bashir had done to become the reporter who reached her. He commissioned fake bank statements. He showed fabricated material to Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. He produced supposed bank statements involving senior royal officials that Dyson found likely contained information Bashir himself had invented. Dyson concluded that these documents deceived Earl Spencer and induced him to arrange Bashir's introduction to Diana. He called Bashir's conduct a serious breach of the BBC's rules on straight dealing. Bashir didn't simply telephone Kensington Palace and ask for an interview. He went through Earl Spencer. The false documents made allegations of payments involving people around Diana and Charles appear real. Earl Spencer carried information from those documents to his sister. Dyson accepted Spencer's evidence that what he'd been shown fitted fears Diana already had about being watched and betrayed. Diana's description of her marriage doesn't become false because of Bashir. Charles's affair doesn't disappear. Her feelings about Camilla weren't planted in her head by a journalist. Those feelings existed years earlier, in her Morton recordings. But the conditions around Panorama weren't clean. Two truths have to stand together. Diana wanted to speak, and Bashir used deception to secure his access to her. Years later, Prince William said the deceitful way the interview had been obtained had, in his view, substantially influenced what his mother said and contributed to her fear and isolation. That is William's judgment about his mother. It isn't a finding that every statement Diana made was unreliable, and it shouldn't be used as one. So when Diana says Camilla was part of the breakdown of her marriage, we listen. We know Charles himself admitted infidelity. We know his office identified Camilla. We know the relationship existed. What we don't do is turn every claim made in that interview into unquestioned fact, simply because Diana said it on the BBC. That would be disrespectful to the evidence. And, in a strange way, disrespectful to Diana too. By the end of 1995, the three people at the center of this story had each lost control in a different way. Charles had tried to explain himself and instead made his adultery headline news. Diana had found a way to speak directly to millions, but the journalist who reached her had used deceptive methods that wouldn't be fully exposed for 25 years. And Camilla had become one of the most discussed women in Britain, while giving the public almost none of her own explanation. The story was now bigger than all three of them. But legally, one barrier still remained. Charles and Diana were separated. They weren't divorced. Then, in 1996, the marriage that had made any future with Camilla politically almost impossible finally came to an end. On 28 August 1996, the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales was formally dissolved. 15 years after St. Paul's Cathedral, Charles and Diana were no longer husband and wife. For the first time, both Charles and Camilla were legally divorced, but anyone who thinks that meant Charles could simply announce an engagement the next morning hasn't understood Britain in 1996. Divorce removed one legal barrier. It didn't remove Diana. Diana remained the mother of the future king. She remained internationally famous. She remained closely identified with the causes she supported, and public sympathy for her remained enormous. Camilla, meanwhile, was still known primarily through adultery, leaked conversations, and the collapse of the Wales marriage. There was also the church. Charles wasn't simply a divorced man thinking about remarriage, he was the future supreme governor of the Church of England. By the summer of 1997, the Archbishop of Canterbury was warning publicly that remarriage by the future head of the church could create a serious problem for the institution. And there was the royal family itself. Acceptance couldn't be announced into existence. The Queen hadn't publicly embraced Camilla. There was no engagement, no agreed title, no statement explaining how William and Harry were expected to relate to their father's partner. Every step had to be read against Diana's continued presence in public life. So Charles and Camilla began moving differently. Not toward marriage yet, toward visibility. Before Britain could be asked to accept Camilla as Charles's wife, it first had to become accustomed to the fact that she wasn't going away. And in July 1997, Charles made the clearest move yet. Camilla turned 50 on 17 July. The following evening, around 80 guests arrived at Highgrove, Charles's Gloucestershire home, for a birthday celebration in her honor. Charles was the host. Camilla was the guest of honor. And this time there was very little attempt to pretend she was simply another person somewhere in Charles's social circle. The New Yorker reported the event almost immediately and described it as open, unapologetic, and widely understood in the British press as another step toward making the relationship publicly legitimate. Look at the date, July 1997. Diana was alive. Later retellings sometimes make it sound as though Charles waited until after Diana's death before trying to bring Camilla into the open. He didn't. A process had already begun. The Highgrove birthday was evidence of it. There was another telling detail. No member of the royal family attended the birthday party. The contemporary New Yorker account resisted pretending it could read the motives behind every absence, but visually, the message was hard to miss. Charles was standing beside Camilla. His family wasn't standing there with them. Television programs were openly debating whether Charles should marry Camilla and remain heir. Polls showed resistance, though contemporary reporting suggested the gap was beginning to narrow. Charles also had a deeply human problem beneath all the constitutional arguments. Camilla had been publicly exposed because of her relationship with him. He couldn't give her royal protection. He couldn't give her an official position. He couldn't yet give her marriage without triggering arguments over the monarchy and church. and he couldn't pretend they were merely old friends anymore. A close friend quoted at the time described Charles as deeply worried about the hostility directed at Camilla and wanting the world to stop being so cruel to her. For perhaps the first time since the scandal had broken, they could begin asking a practical question rather than a secret one. Not, can we continue this relationship? They already had. The question was, can we ever live it openly? Highgrove suggested the answer might eventually be yes. They were nowhere near the crown, but they were no longer completely in hiding. After 25 years of stops, marriages, secrecy, and scandal, the relationship was slowly moving toward daylight. Then came the date that shattered every plan. 6 weeks after Charles had begun allowing the world to see that Camilla had a place in his future, Diana died in Paris. And from that moment, almost every calculation changed. There's no reason to retell the accident here. Anyone who lived through that morning remembers the shock. Diana died on 31 August 1997. Charles flew to Paris with Diana's sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows, and accompanied her coffin back to Britain. Days later, he walked behind that coffin with 15-year-old William and 12-year-old Harry, alongside Prince Philip and Earl Spencer. But before we talk about what Diana's death meant for Camilla, the order of suffering needs to be acknowledged. William and Harry had lost their mother. The Spencer family had lost Diana. Millions of people were grieving a woman they felt they'd watched grow from a 19-year-old bride into someone they believed they knew. Queen Elizabeth II herself spoke publicly about helping William and Harry deal with what she called their devastating loss. Camilla's problem belongs after all of that. But it was real. Before Diana died, Charles's advisors had been slowly trying to make the idea of Camilla less impossible. Not popular, not yet, simply possible. Reuters later reported that Diana's death shattered the plan Charles and his communications team had been developing to introduce Camilla gradually into public life. Only weeks earlier, the problem had been how to move forward. Now the problem was whether moving forward at all would look intolerable. The anger after Diana's death wasn't abstract. Some of it was directed at the monarchy, some at Charles, and some very directly at Camilla. Reuters recorded one mourner outside Diana's home saying Camilla should leave the country. The statement proves nothing about responsibility for Diana's death. What it shows is the emotional climate Camilla faced. There was simply no safe way for Charles to present her publicly in that atmosphere. If Camilla appeared beside him too soon, it would look as though Diana had been replaced. If Charles began talking about marriage, it would look grotesquely insensitive while his sons were grieving their mother. If Camilla tried to defend herself, she risked placing herself in competition with a dead woman who could no longer answer back. So the future went quiet, not the relationship, the public future. And that silence lasted longer than anyone around Charles had expected. There was something else that made this different from every earlier setback. Diana was now frozen in public memory. She would never grow older, never make another mistake, never give another interview, never change her mind about Charles, never change her mind about Camilla. Camilla would continue aging in front of the public. Diana wouldn't. That was a reality no public relations campaign could erase, and Charles had a responsibility that mattered far more immediately than Camilla's acceptance. William and Harry. Whatever Charles wanted personally, he couldn't behave as though becoming publicly established with Camilla was the urgent issue. The boys came first. Time came next. Legal freedom had arrived. Public freedom had disappeared. So Charles did something unusual. He stopped trying to make Britain accept Camilla quickly, and began moving in inches. For most of 1998, there was no dramatic unveiling, no engagement, no royal photo call, no palace speech asking Britain to reconsider Camilla Parker Bowles. Instead, Charles's team worked on something smaller: visibility. The central figure in that effort was Mark Bolland, the communications specialist working for the Prince of Wales. Bolland's importance can be exaggerated until it sounds as though he personally invented a new Camilla. He didn't. No press officer could erase the affair, Diana's words, the telephone recording, or years of public anger. What he could do was change the question. Instead of asking, "Will you accept Camilla as Charles's future wife?" ask something much easier first. Can Charles and Camilla be photographed together without the monarchy collapsing? That was the real test. And by January 1999, they were ready to run it. The occasion was almost deliberately ordinary. Camilla's sister, Annabel Elliot, was celebrating her 50th birthday at the Ritz Hotel in London. Charles would attend, Camilla would attend, but they arrived separately. Nobody needed a dramatic entrance. The photograph everybody wanted would come later. Late on 28 January 1999, photographers gathered outside the hotel knowing something unusual was about to happen. They waited. Then the doors opened. Charles and Camilla came out together. ITV's retrospective account confirms that they left the Ritz shortly before midnight and were photographed publicly as a couple for the first time. Look at how little actually happened. They walked through a doorway. No kiss, no engagement ring, no palace balcony, no announcement, no demand that anyone forgive anybody. Two middle-aged people left a birthday party together while cameras flashed, and yet after everything that had happened, that walk carried enormous weight. The Guardian described it as part of the carefully managed campaign to make the relationship publicly acceptable. Accounts from inside Charles's office recalled that some staff believed even this was happening too soon. But something important didn't happen. There was no national explosion strong enough to force them back underground. One staff recollection later summed up the result with striking simplicity. The sky didn't fall in. That was progress, not love, not forgiveness. Progress. Once Britain had seen Charles and Camilla deliberately step out together, pretending she was simply an old family friend became pointless. The relationship had entered public life, and the strategy continued cautiously. Not every appearance was treated as a referendum on Diana anymore. Not every photograph caused a constitutional panic. Camilla was becoming visible enough that the shock itself began wearing off. Familiarity could do something persuasion couldn't. You didn't have to tell people to like her. You simply stopped hiding her. But there was one obstacle no carefully arranged hotel exit could solve. Charles could allow photographers to see Camilla. He could stand beside her. His staff could plan appearances. The newspapers could slowly adjust. None of that answered the question hanging over the relationship from the beginning. What did the Queen think? And in June 2000, Elizabeth II gave the public something far more meaningful than a palace briefing. She entered the same room. On 3 June 2000, Charles hosted a 60th birthday gathering at Highgrove for Constantine, the former king of Greece. Camilla was among the guests. The Queen knew she would be there, and Elizabeth attended anyway. Buckingham Palace confirmed the Queen's presence and confirmed that Camilla was among the guests. Contemporary reporting said the two women met during the gathering. William and Harry were there as well, because this wasn't any mother attending her son's party. The Queen's movements around Camilla had acquired constitutional meaning whether Elizabeth wanted them to or not. If she stayed away, newspapers read rejection. If she appeared, they read acceptance. And until then, Elizabeth had kept a noticeable distance from Camilla's acknowledged place in Charles's life. The Guardian reported that the Highgrove meeting marked the end of what it described as the Queen's effective avoidance of meeting Camilla in this new public context. A royal source explained the timing in 4 understated words. The time was right. Not Camilla has been forgiven. Not the Queen approves a marriage. Not Camilla will join the royal family. The time was right. Palace language at its most revealing. It says enough without promising anything. Buckingham Palace remained careful immediately afterward. A spokesman refused to predict Camilla's attendance at future private royal gatherings. Charles's own spokeswoman maintained that he had no plans to remarry at that point. So this wasn't the wedding door swinging open. It was one lock being removed. William and Harry witnessed it. They were 17 and 15. 3 years earlier, they'd walked behind their mother's coffin. Now they were present as their grandmother and their father's long-term partner occupied the same family gathering. Camilla could never be integrated into Charles's life by dealing only with newspapers or advisors. His sons were part of the equation. His mother was part of it. The wider family was part of it. The Highgrove meeting gave the first strong public sign that Queen Elizabeth II was willing to allow that process to move forward. Willingness isn't enthusiasm. Presence isn't blessing. One meeting isn't acceptance, but royal change often arrives exactly like this, not with declarations, with doors that stop being closed. And after the Queen entered that room, Camilla faced a new kind of challenge. For years, she'd been defined by what she'd done privately with Charles. If she was ever going to have a permanent public place beside him, people would need to see what she could do in public without him. That change didn't happen through one glamorous event. It happened through work. Osteoporosis remained one of her longest-standing causes. By 2001, Camilla had become president of the National Osteoporosis Society. The royal household records that she'd supported the organization since 1994. the year her mother died from the disease. That gave Camilla something she'd badly lacked during the scandal years, a public identity that wasn't simply Charles's lover. She could stand in a room and speak about something that had nothing to do with Diana, meet patients, talk to doctors, help raise awareness, do the unglamorous, repetitive work royal patronage actually requires. Then the relationship itself became visibly easier to acknowledge. On 21 June 2002, Charles and Camilla kissed publicly for the first time. The following month, Camilla joined what contemporary reporting described as her first royal engagement in Edinburgh. Look at how the steps were being taken. 1999, leave a hotel together. 2000, occupy the same family gathering as the Queen. 2001, deepen an independent charitable role. 2002, show affection publicly, then appear at a setting connected to Charles's royal work. There was no single morning when Britain woke up and decided Camilla Parker Bowles was acceptable. She became harder to exclude one small event at a time. And that required something from her too. Remaining Charles's private companion had offered a kind of protection. Private people can avoid crowds, they can refuse engagements, they can stay home when newspapers are unpleasant. A woman moving toward the future king's side couldn't do that forever. Eventually, she would have to stand where people could see her, and there was no guarantee they'd be friendly. The Guardian recalled that even in the years approaching the marriage, the possibility of public booing remained a genuine concern around Camilla's appearances. After the Queen Mother's death in 2002, Clarence House underwent major refurbishment. In 2003, Charles moved from York House into Clarence House, which became his official London residence and also the official London residence of William and Harry. It would later become the London base Charles and Camilla were associated with as a married couple. By July 2004, Camilla's name appeared in an official royal corporate document for the first time, another small administrative step that contemporary reporting marked as part of her gradual movement into recognized royal life. A scandal can live on newspaper front pages without changing anything institutionally. Putting somebody into the paperwork means the institution itself has started accounting for their presence. Camilla was no longer merely being tolerated at the edge of Charles's life. She was becoming part of how that life actually operated. And that created the next unavoidable question. She couldn't remain indefinitely as the divorced private partner of the future king while carrying out increasingly public duties beside him. The halfway position had worked when the monarchy needed time. By the end of 2004, time itself was becoming the problem. If Charles believed Camilla was his permanent partner, there were really only two paths left: formalize her place, or leave her permanently exposed in a role the monarchy had never properly defined. By 2005, hiding was no longer sustainable. Charles would either marry her or leave her forever standing just outside the door. On 10 February 2005, Clarence House finally confirmed what had once seemed almost impossible. Charles and Camilla were going to marry. But even that announcement came wrapped in caution. Charles was the heir to the throne. Both he and Camilla were divorced. His first wife had died. Camilla had spent years at the center of public arguments about Charles, Diana, the monarchy, and the church. Before a single wedding photograph could be taken, questions were already being raised about law, religion, titles, and the crown itself. On 2 March 2005, the Privy Council met to give formal effect to Queen Elizabeth II's consent under the Royal Marriages Act 1772. Then MPs asked a striking question. Would this be a morganatic marriage? Could Charles marry Camilla while somehow preventing her from receiving the status normally belonging to the wife of a future king? The government's answer was one word: no. Legally, Camilla wasn't going to become some lesser category of wife. Charles was marrying her fully. But publicly, the monarchy was still trying to soften what that marriage meant. The clearest example was her title. When Charles married Camilla, she legally became Princess of Wales. But she wouldn't use it. Parliament confirmed that explicitly. Camilla would be known as HRH, the Duchess of Cornwall, and in Scotland as the Duchess of Rothesay. The reason didn't need spelling out. Princess of Wales was Diana's title in the public mind. And there was an even bigger title waiting further ahead: Queen. When the marriage was announced, the official position was that if Charles became king, Camilla intended to be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen. Reuters confirmed this had been the expectation attached to the 2005 marriage. Charles was the future king. Camilla was becoming his lawful wife. The government had confirmed the marriage wasn't morganatic, Yet the palace still wasn't prepared to tell Britain that Charles's wife would one day be called queen. The relationship had been accepted enough for marriage. It hadn't been accepted enough for the monarchy to follow the normal language of monarchy without qualification. Even the wedding itself reflected that caution. No St. Paul's Cathedral, no vast state occasion, no attempt to recreate 1981. The couple's civil ceremony was originally scheduled for 8 April, but the funeral of Pope John Paul II took place that day, and Charles attended as Prince of Wales. The wedding took place on 9 April 2005. Everything about the event seemed to carry the weight of the history behind it. And then there was the Queen. Elizabeth II had given the legal consent required for her son's marriage, but she and Prince Philip didn't attend the civil ceremony itself. They attended the religious service afterward and hosted the reception at Windsor Castle. That distinction was impossible to miss. Contemporary reporting confirmed the Queen wasn't at the Guildhall ceremony, but did attend the later blessing. It would be too simple to call that rejection. She had approved the marriage, she stood with the couple later that day, she hosted their reception. But the Queen was also Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and the marriage of two divorced people whose former spouses were still living carried religious sensitivity. Once again, Camilla was being accepted and held at a distance at the same time. After more than 30 years, Camilla had finally reached the wedding. But even on the day itself, the palace was still putting distance between Camilla and the crown. On 9 April 2005, Charles and Camilla arrived at Windsor Guildhall. There were no cathedral steps, no enormous royal procession, no attempt to tell Britain that history had reset itself. The civil ceremony was small. Their children were there. William and Harry attended for Charles. Tom and Laura were there for Camilla. Charles and Camilla emerged from the Guildhall as husband and wife. The royal household records it plainly, a civil ceremony at the Guildhall in Windsor, followed by a service of prayer and dedication at St. George's Chapel. For all the years of secrecy, taped conversations, divorces, newspaper hostility, and carefully managed appearances, the legal act was remarkably simple. They signed the register, they walked outside, they were married. Camilla became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Cornwall. Then came the part of the day that carried much more royal symbolism. At St. George's Chapel, around 800 guests gathered for the service of prayer and dedication. The Queen was there, Prince Philip was there, William and Harry were there, Camilla's family was there, and after the service, Queen Elizabeth II hosted the reception at Windsor Castle. The religious service also contained words of repentance taken from the Book of Common Prayer. Charles and Camilla joined the congregation in acknowledging sin and asking forgiveness. That detail was immediately interpreted through the history everyone knew, but they weren't standing before the Archbishop giving a specially written confession of adultery. The penitential words belonged to a communal Christian form of worship. The wedding wasn't an attempt to rewrite the past, and it couldn't have been. Diana had existed. Andrew Parker Bowles had existed. Two families had been affected. Years of pain couldn't be removed by changing Camilla's surname or giving her HRH. The day could formalize Charles and Camilla's future. It couldn't absolve their history. There was something almost revealing in how restrained the civil wedding looked. Charles had once married in front of an audience measured in hundreds of millions. Now, in his 50s, he married in a municipal building in Windsor, with a small circle around him. There was no convincing way to sell this as another fairy tale. Perhaps that helped, because the marriage didn't need to promise perfection. It only needed to answer one question. Was Camilla going to remain beside Charles permanently? Yes. That question was finally settled, but another one wasn't. The official expectation still pointed toward princess consort rather than queen. Camilla could become Charles's wife. She could become a senior royal. She could live beside the future king, but nobody yet knew whether the country, or Queen Elizabeth II herself, would ever be comfortable with the full meaning of that position. The wedding settled whom Charles wanted beside him. It didn't settle whether Britain would ever accept what that really meant. If you appreciate stories where we separate documented facts from rumor, give this video a like. It helps more people find this channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, stay with us, because you don't need another channel telling you who to love, who to hate, or what you're supposed to think about the royal family. You deserve the dates, the voices, the records, and the context. Then you make up your own mind. Now stay with me. Because this next part is where Camilla's position changes in a way that a wedding alone could never accomplish. After the photographs were taken, Camilla faced a problem marriage couldn't solve for her. She had spent years being known for one thing. Now she had to become known for something else. Just 6 weeks after the wedding, on 23 May 2005, Camilla carried out her first solo official engagement as Duchess of Cornwall at Southampton General Hospital. The royal household records it as her first solo engagement in the role. Walking into a hospital without Charles beside her meant there was nowhere to hide inside his status. People were coming to meet her. The cameras were there for her. The questions about whether she belonged in royal life were now hers to answer through behavior, not statements. And that became the pattern of the next 16 years. Not one enormous campaign telling Britain to forgive her. Work, repeatedly, often quietly. Osteoporosis remained one of her longest-standing causes. Then came literacy, animal welfare, the arts, support for people affected by rape, sexual assault, and domestic abuse. By the years after her marriage, the royal household recorded Camilla as patron or president of more than 100 organizations. Those subjects gave her a public identity that didn't depend on Charles's marriage history. A woman whose name had once appeared beside Diana's in hostile headlines was now meeting patients, readers, charity workers, survivors, and volunteers. Not everybody changed their mind. Some never did. And Camilla herself seemed to understand that acceptance couldn't be demanded. One moment in 2007 shows just how carefully she still had to move. A service was planned to mark the 10th anniversary of Diana's death. William and Harry invited Camilla. At first, she intended to attend. Then criticism grew. Rosa Monckton, one of Diana's close friends, publicly said Camilla's presence would be inappropriate. Camilla withdrew. She said she'd been touched by William and Harry's invitation, but she didn't want her attendance to divert attention from the purpose of the occasion. That decision reveals something the wedding hadn't changed. Camilla could be Charles's wife. She could stand with the royal family. But Diana's memory still created places where Camilla understood that her presence itself could become the story. Sometimes the only way to protect the occasion was not to attend at all. That's the balancing act she continued living with. Not pretending Diana hadn't existed, not trying to take possession of Diana's memory, and not expecting the public to forget why the name Camilla Parker Bowles had once caused so much anger. Over time, though, the institution began giving Camilla marks of trust that went far beyond photographs beside Charles. In April 2012, Queen Elizabeth II appointed her Dame Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, an honor given personally by the sovereign for service to the monarchy. In 2016, Elizabeth appointed Camilla to the Privy Council, and in 2022, she made her a Royal Lady of the Order of the Garter, Britain's oldest and most senior order of chivalry. The woman who had once been kept far from any official place beside Charles was now being drawn steadily deeper into the institution by the Queen herself. No speech announced that Camilla's reputation had been repaired. Royal families rarely work that way. Instead, the evidence appeared in appointments. Access, responsibility, presence, trust. And by early 2022, almost 17 years had passed since the wedding. Camilla was no longer an experiment. She'd represented the monarchy abroad. She'd carried out hundreds of engagements. She'd taken on patronages once held by other senior royals. She appeared beside the Queen, beside Charles, beside William and Catherine. The unanswered question from 2005 was becoming increasingly strange. If Charles became king, what exactly was his wife going to be called? The old answer still hung there. Princess Consort. Then Queen Elizabeth II, aged 95, decided to answer the question herself. And she didn't do it through an anonymous briefing. She put it in writing. On 5 February 2022, the eve of the 70th anniversary of her accession, Queen Elizabeth II released a personal message. Most of it looked backward. She thanked the public. She reflected on 7 decades of service. She remembered Prince Philip and the role he'd played beside her. Then Elizabeth turned toward the monarchy after her own reign. She spoke about Charles and Camilla. Her wording was unmistakable. When Charles became king, Elizabeth wrote, it was her sincere wish that Camilla should be known as Queen Consort as she continued her loyal service. This was the answer 2005 had refused to give, and it came from the one person whose approval carried more weight than any courtier, poll, or newspaper editorial, the Queen herself. In 2005, Camilla legally became Princess of Wales but didn't use the title. The official plan said she would one day be Princess Consort. 17 years later, Elizabeth II personally asked the country to accept Camilla as Queen Consort. Reuters described the statement as removing the lingering doubt around Camilla's future status. That wasn't a change in vocabulary, it was Elizabeth placing her personal authority behind Camilla's place in the next reign. Charles responded publicly by saying he and Camilla were deeply conscious of the honor represented by his mother's wish, and he described his wife as his steadfast support. For years, people had tried to read the Queen's feelings through who attended which party, where Camilla sat, which photograph appeared, which title was used, and which invitation was extended. Now there was nothing left to decode. Elizabeth had written it herself. 7 months later, on 8 September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died. Charles became king immediately. Camilla became queen consort. Then, on 6 May 2023, Charles and Camilla entered Westminster Abbey for the coronation. The woman whose future royal title had once required careful wording was crowned beside him. The relationship had begun before either of them had married anyone else. It survived other marriages, public exposure, divorce, Diana's death, years of uncertain acceptance, a wedding that still stopped short of promising Camilla the title of queen. Then the queen, who had once kept her distance, became the person who cleared away the final ambiguity. But ending this story at Westminster Abbey would miss the most revealing image Camilla ever gave us of life with Charles. Months before Elizabeth died, Camilla spoke to British Vogue ahead of her 75th birthday. She was asked how she and Charles found time for their marriage when royal schedules constantly pulled them in different directions. Her answer was ordinary. They tried to find a point in the day when they could meet. They'd sit down, have tea, talk about what had happened, and when they were away from official life, Camilla said one of the nicest things was simply sitting in different corners of the same room, both of them reading. They didn't need to keep talking, they could just be there together. After everything else in this story, that image lands differently. Not Buckingham Palace, not a crown, not thousands of people watching from behind barriers. A room, 2 books, silence, and that's where the title changes meaning. Because the question was never simply whether Camilla eventually got Charles. We know she did. The harder question is what remained after getting there had cost so much. There's no clean verdict here. There shouldn't be. If we turned Camilla into the innocent heroine, we'd have to erase people who were hurt. If we reduced her to the villain, we'd have to erase half a century of evidence showing that the relationship was more complicated than a single affair. Neither version is honest. Diana's pain was real. Camilla's later treatment doesn't cancel it. Charles and Camilla crossed boundaries while married to other people. The fact that they eventually remained together doesn't make those choices harmless. But the opposite is also true. Acknowledging what happened inside Charles and Diana's marriage doesn't require inventing motives for Camilla that the record can't prove. It doesn't require pretending she spent every year from her 20s plotting to reach the throne, and it doesn't require treating every humiliation directed at her as deserved simply because the public was angry. What the evidence shows is messier. People made decisions, then lived inside the consequences. Some consequences were private, some were played out in front of millions. Children grew up around them. Marriages ended. A monarchy had to decide how much of the past it could carry into the future without pretending that past hadn't happened. And Camilla herself had to find a place inside an institution where, for years, even the title attached to her future had been treated as too sensitive to say out loud. There was no single moment when all of that disappeared. The 2005 wedding didn't do it. Public work didn't do it. Honors didn't do it. Even Elizabeth's 2022 statement didn't rewrite what came before. It did something different. It settled the future. The fact that Charles and Camilla eventually married doesn't prove they were destined to marry. It proves that, after everything that happened, neither ultimately chose a life without the other. That may sound romantic. It isn't an excuse. Love and damage can exist in the same story. So can loyalty and selfishness. So can endurance and regret. Camilla's suffering doesn't erase Diana's. Diana's suffering doesn't require us to invent evidence against Camilla. Charles and Camilla staying together doesn't make the affair morally harmless. And recognizing that their relationship endured doesn't mean pretending nobody around them paid a price for it. Perhaps that's why the quiet image from Clarence House feels more truthful than the coronation. Charles and Camilla sitting in one room, a book in each pair of hands. No explanation left to give each other. No photographer required. No title being negotiated. No public argument happening between them. For a relationship that spent half a century making noise around the world, perhaps the thing they waited longest for was simply the right to be quiet together. And if you value royal stories that separate what really happened from what we've simply been told for years, give this video a like and subscribe. There's still so much of this family's history that only makes sense when we go back to the evidence. Because there was another person whose acceptance mattered almost as much as the Queen's, William. And the private story of how Diana's eldest son came to live with Camilla's place beside his father is far more complicated than the headlines ever made it sound.